He didn't say a word when she told him the diagnosis. He just set down his coffee, checked his phone, and left the kitchen. Lorelei Vance had spent 38 years learning how to read silence. The silence of a classroom when a student doesn't know the answer. The silence after a hard conversation with a parent who doesn't want to hear the truth. The silence of a house that used to be full of noise. She knew all of those silences. But the one that settled over the kitchen that Tuesday morning in October was a kind she hadn't encountered before. Cold and purposeful, like a door being shut from the inside. She'd found the lump herself 3 weeks earlier, during a routine moment in the shower. She hadn't panicked. That surprised her. She'd stood there with the water going cold around her ankles and thought, very calmly, I need to call Dr. Mambatha tomorrow morning. And she had. And the appointments came, one after another, and the results came back, and the oncologist at Sunnybrook sat across from her with kind eyes and said the word, breast cancer. Stage 2, caught early, good prognosis, treatable, and Lorelei had nodded and taken the printed folder and thanked him by name. She hadn't told her husband until she had a treatment plan in hand. She thought that was the responsible thing to do. She didn't want to frighten him with half information. She'd always been like that, careful, thorough, a woman who waited until she understood something fully before she spoke about it. 36 years in the Toronto District School Board had trained that into her. You don't go to parents without your facts straight. His name was Garrett Vance. She'd been Laura Limbamara before they married 22 years ago, in a small ceremony at her parents' home in Scarborough. She kept Mbamara hyphenated for years at work, Lorelei Mbamara Vance, but everyone called her Mrs. Vance. She had stopped correcting them somewhere around year 15. Garrett was a senior VP at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm, with offices in downtown Toronto and Calgary. He wore expensive watches and flew business class and always referred to himself as self-made, which wasn't entirely accurate. His uncle had handed him his first property deal. But Lorelei had never said that out loud. Some things you let people have. When she told him that Tuesday morning, he set down his coffee. He checked his phone. He said he had a call at 9 that he couldn't miss, and he left. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The coffee maker was still warm. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the ravine behind the houses. The oak tree in the backyard had started to turn, that particular orange-red that only lasts about 4 days before the leaves all come down at once. She watched it through the window and thought, maybe he just needs a moment. He came home that evening with takeout from the Thai place on Yonge. He set the containers on the counter and asked if she'd eaten. She said no. They ate pad see ew in something close to companionable silence, and she thought, there, he's processing. He'll come around. He did not come around. The weeks that followed had a quality she still finds hard to describe. Treatment started, 4 rounds of chemotherapy, followed by radiation, with surgery to be decided based on response. The oncology team at Sunnybrook was exceptional. Her nurse, a tall Jamaican-Canadian woman named Doreen, who called everyone sweetheart without it feeling condescending, talked her through every side effect before it happened, so that Lorelei felt informed rather than ambushed. She appreciated that enormously. Garrett drove her to the first chemo session. He sat in the waiting room with his laptop and worked. She didn't mind that, exactly. She'd brought papers to mark herself, left over from a curriculum review she'd been doing for the board. They were both people who needed to keep their hands busy. But somewhere around the 3rd hour, when the nausea started and she asked a nurse to fetch him, he came back to her curtained bay looking slightly inconvenienced, and something in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the cancer, went very quiet. Her sister, a Daisy, drove her to every subsequent session. A Daisy lived in Mississauga with her husband and their youngest, still at home, and she would make the drive on treatment days without being asked, always arriving with a cooler bag. Ginger tea, saltine crackers, whatever Lorelei had mentioned the previous week that she thought she might be able to stomach. She sat beside her during the sessions, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, and it was the most natural thing in the world. Garrett, meanwhile, became busy in a way that felt architectural. His schedule filled up. There were dinners he couldn't skip, a trip to Calgary that couldn't be moved, a weekend conference in Banff. Lorelei didn't ask too many questions. She was tired in a way that went beyond the body. The kind of tired where you don't have the bandwidth to also manage someone else's discomfort with your illness. It was Adizi who noticed first. "He's barely home," she said, one evening in December. They were in Lorelei's kitchen, and Lorelei was wrapped in the weighted blanket she'd started keeping on the couch because the cold had become unbearable to her, even inside. "He's busy. The Calgary deal is complicated." Lorelei. Adaze said her name the way their mother used to, flat, factual, with nothing wasted. "I know," Lorelei said. And she did know. She had known for a while, but knowing and being ready to look at the thing directly are two separate processes, and she wasn't there yet. She got there in January. She'd had a bad week. The second round of chemo, which the team had warned her would likely hit harder than the first, and she'd been in bed for 3 days. Garrett had been home, nominally, but she'd heard him on the phone in the study until past midnight 2 nights in a row. And when she'd asked, gently, he'd said it was a client in Vancouver. The time difference, nothing to worry about. On the third night, she got up to get water around 2 in the morning, and she saw his phone on the kitchen counter, screen lit. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. She could see from 3 feet away. The name on the screen was Justine, and below it a message that began, "Miss you already. When are you back?" She got her water. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to her husband on the phone down the hall and thought, so that's what this is. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry, and also, and this took her longer to admit, she wasn't entirely surprised. There had been other years, other distances. There had been a period when their daughter was small where she'd wondered, but she'd chosen to focus on the family and the work and the life they were building, and the wondering had gone somewhere and stayed there. Now it was back, and it had brought company. His name was Garrett Vance, and he had a woman named Justine, and Lorelei's hair was falling out in the bathroom sink, and she had a mortgage and a treatment plan, and a sister who drove to Sunnybrook twice a month with ginger tea. She let herself feel that for exactly 1 night. Then she called a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Francesca Lim. She'd been recommended by a colleague at the board. Sharp, experienced in high-asset separations, and, crucially, discreet. Lorelei met her at her office on Bay Street on a Thursday afternoon in late January, wearing the good wig she'd bought when she realized the hair loss was going to be more extensive than hoped. She laid everything out in the organized way she'd spent her career perfecting. The marriage, the assets, the mortgage, the property, and the one piece of information she had not yet shared with anyone. "The Bancroft property," Francesca Lim said, looking up from her notepad. "That's in your name alone?" "My maiden name, technically. Mimbamara. My grandmother left it to me, specifically and individually, before my marriage." The will was explicit. The transfer of title happened before the wedding. It was never commingled. Francesca wrote something, then looked up again. "Does your husband know the details of the property?" Lorelei considered the question. "He knows it exists. I don't think he's ever looked at the particulars." The Bancroft property was 47 acres in Prince Edward County, about 2 hours east of Toronto. Lorelei's grandmother, her mother's mother, Grandma Beatrice, who'd come to Canada from Nigeria in the early 1970s and worked 30 years at a textile factory in Hamilton before she retired and moved to the county, had bought the land in 1988 for almost nothing and held on to it through every boom and bust because she said she liked the way the light came in off the lake in the afternoons, and she was not going to sell a thing she loved just because someone offered her money. When Grandma Beatrice died in 2009, she left the property to Lorelei and the savings account to Adaze, with a note that said simply, "I know which one of you will take care of it." Lorelei had maintained the property for 15 years, paid the taxes, kept the small farmhouse on the eastern edge in good repair, rented it out to a local couple on a long-term lease so it wouldn't sit empty. She'd never told Garrett what it was currently worth, and he'd never asked, because it had always been, in the implicit language of their marriage, her thing. He had his business interests. She had her grandmother's land. Neither of them had ever needed to cross that line. What neither of them had understood, or what Garrett had not understood, because Lorelei had quietly come to understand it very well, was what had happened to land values in Prince Edward County over the past 10 years. The wineries, the boutique hotels, the Toronto money moving east. The county had transformed into one of the most sought-after real estate markets in Ontario. 47 acres with lakefront access, a habitable structure, and a clean title had a current assessed value that would have made Garrett's Calgary deal look modest. Francesca Lim, who had presumably seen numbers that surprised her before, was quiet for a moment after the appraisal documents were laid on the desk. "All right," she said. "Then I think we have a clear picture." She did not hear from Garrett's lawyer for 2 weeks after the papers were served. When she did, the communication had a particular quality, a recalibration happening in real time. The initial posture had been, from what Francesca relayed, quite confident. Garrett's team had spoken about the matrimonial home, about his pension, about what he anticipated receiving in terms of support. They had clearly done their calculations based on an incomplete spreadsheet. The call that followed, between the two lawyers, lasted 40 minutes. Francesca's summary to Lorelei afterward was brief. "He didn't know about the appraisal. He does now." Garrett called her himself that evening. That was a first. He called from what sounded like a restaurant. She could hear background noise, glasses, something low playing, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in years. Not anger. Something closer to panic with a thin shell of composure over top. "I think we should talk," he said. "We should have talked in October," Lorelei said. "When I came home with the diagnosis, we should have talked in November, when you started flying to Calgary every other week. We should have talked in January, when I saw a text from Justine on your phone at 2 in the morning. A pause, long enough that she could hear the restaurant clearly. "Lorelei, I've engaged a lawyer. Francesca has her contact information. I'm going to focus on my health." She hung up. She wasn't proud of the fact that she felt something close to satisfaction in that moment. She'd always liked to think of herself as someone above the pettier satisfactions. But she was also human, and she'd spent 4 months being quietly devastated while undergoing chemotherapy, and the sound of his voice thinning when he realized the ground had shifted. She allowed herself that. The treatment was working. The oncologist, Dr. Okonkwo, a calm, methodical man who delivered information like he was giving a patient an owner's manual for their own body, which Lorelei found immensely helpful, told her at the February scan that the tumor had responded well, better than the median projection. She would continue with radiation, and they'd discuss surgery in the spring, but the trajectory was positive. She called Adaze from the Sunnybrook parking lot. Adaze cried. Lorelei didn't quite, but she sat in her car for 20 minutes and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in months, the specific relief of being told that you will probably be okay. Spring came. The oak in the backyard put on its leaves again, later than she remembered from past years. Or maybe she just never paid that close attention before. She sold the matrimonial home. Both their names on that one, clean split, agreed without drama, because Garrett's lawyer had done the math, and he was not in a position to be dramatic. The proceeds were fair. She wasn't trying to take him apart. She was trying to get to the other side of the year intact. She kept the Bancroft property. That was never on the table. She rented a small apartment in Leslieville while she figured out next steps. The apartment had big windows and worn hardwood floors and a radiator that knocked in the night, and she liked it. She liked the particular freedom of a space that was entirely hers. No negotiation. No one else's preferences superimposed over her own. She painted the bedroom a shade of green that she'd always wanted, and that Garrett had once said was too dark for a bedroom. And she put her grandmother's photograph on the windowsill. And she slept better than she had in years. Doreen, her chemo nurse, threw her a small unofficial celebration when she finished radiation. This was technically not a standard oncology department practice, but Doreen operated on her own calendar. She brought a small box of jollof rice from a place she knew and set it on the nurse's station and made Lorelei eat it before she left and told her she was one of the good ones. Lorelei drove home through the city with the windows down. It was May, and the city had that particular quality it gets in May when the winter has finally truly released its hold. Generous, a little surprised at itself. She drove over the Bloor Viaduct and looked out at the Don Valley and thought about her grandmother standing in Prince Edward County watching the light come in off the lake and refusing to sell. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with the property. She'd talked to a few people. An architect her colleague had introduced her to, a woman who'd done several adaptive reuse projects around Ontario, a friend of Adaze's husband who worked in agricultural conservation. She wasn't in a hurry. The land had waited 15 years for her to figure it out. It could wait a little longer. What she knew was this. Garrett had spent 22 years alongside her and had never once looked closely enough at the life they shared to understand what was actually in it. He'd seen the house, the income, the pension, the woman who made things work. He'd never seen the land she'd carried in her name since she was 31 years old, or what it meant, or what it was worth, in any of the senses of that word. She found out, in June, through a mutual friend, that Justine had not moved to Toronto to be with Garrett. She didn't know what had happened between them, and she didn't spend much time trying to find out. The information arrived, she registered it, she moved on, she had things to do. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in July. Francesca called her at noon. Lorelei was at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, going through a report for the board. She'd gone back to work in the spring, part-time at first, and she'd missed it, the specific texture of the work, the kids, the problems that were solvable if you just put in the hours. She thanked Francesca, who told her she'd been a pleasure to work with, which lawyers sometimes said and didn't mean, but which felt, in this case, genuine. She made herself a proper lunch. She called Adese. She went for a long walk along the waterfront in the late afternoon, when the light was coming in low over the lake, and everything had that golden hour quality that makes even ordinary things look significant. She thought about her grandmother, who'd come to a country that was not hers, in a decade that was not particularly welcoming, and who'd worked for 30 years and bought 47 acres because she liked the light, and she wasn't going to sell something she loved. She thought, I'm the one who takes care of things. And the city moved around her, and the light held as long as it could, and then it went, the way light does, without apology, leaving everything a little changed.